start and right about now. So, welcome to the SDSU Studio Series. In the midst of what's happening in the world today, we have created a series of digital conversations with Broadway professionals where we talk about the craft and the business of Broadway and how we can pass along this legacy to the next generation of musical theater artists. The SDSU Studio Series is organized by the SDSU MFA Musical Theater Program. This program is one of only a handful of graduate degrees offered in the United States that offer the terminal degree in musical theater. And our graduates are acting, directing, choreographing, music directing, writing, and teaching in university positions worldwide. Our goal is to bring the professional world and the academic world together so that students of the musical theater are prepared for today's job market. My name is Robert Meff. I worked as a professional conductor, music director, and orchestrator on Broadway for 22 years before moving to San Diego to become head of the MFA Musical Theater Program. My goal is that every person who wants to be a musical theater artist is able to access what is going on in the professional world, which led me to creating this series and leads me to my guest, Mary Mitchell Campbell. Welcome, Mary Mitchell.
Hello.
Before we begin, I want to give some expectations of today's discussion. If you have any questions for Mary Mitchell, feel free to use the question and answer function built into Zoom. After my questions are completed, I will ask questions from your submissions. For those of you out there, if anyone's from a university musical theater program, go to the chat function and type the name of your school in the chat function. I would love to see who's represented here. Thanks so much. So let's begin. Mary Mitchell Campbell is a conductor, music director, orchestrator, composer, and arranger. She has served as the music director for many Broadway shows, including Mean Girls, The Prom, My Love Letter to Broadway with Kristen Chenoweth, Talk Everlasting, Finding Neverland, Big Fish, The Addams Family, Company, and Sweeney Todd. She also music directed Stephen Sondheim's very last musical, Roadshow, at the Public Theater. Thanks so much for coming here, Mary Mitchell.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. So I'm going to start out with the question that all of us are really asking ourselves, which is the university musical theater community is adapting to the coronavirus outbreak by migrating classes online and providing content like this interview to students and educators nationwide. How is Broadway coping, and how are you coping?
Okay. Well, I think Broadway is just sort of on a big giant pause at the moment. We are coping by, well, I'm currently doing Mean Girls. So we are coping by doing sort of Zoom hangouts to keep in touch with each other. I have a Mean Girls orchestra hangout coming up in a couple days. And so we're sort of staying in touch and trying to keep each other involved in whatever news we're hearing about what's happening with the industry. But currently we're just in a really big pause mode. And then the pieces that I have that are in development are also in pause mode, though I did do a Zoom reading of a new musical this week, which was extremely interesting and exciting, and the first time that that's happened in my lifetime anyway. And so
how did that work? Did you play tracks, or did you
it was actually well, we created piano tracks of accompaniments, and the composer is also a performer, so they sang into a high-level microphone and performed the entire score while the cast read the script, and then we just stopped anytime there was internal dialogue. But it actually functioned much better than I anticipated. So it was good. We got like a good sort of scope of the piece, and it was a good opportunity for the cast to jump in, and we had a lot of availability of high-level performers because they are available. So that was nice. And then I have one piece that was supposed to go to Williamstown Theater Festival this summer that is now going to be done sort of as a radio play for Audible, the company Audible. So we're doing a recording of it. I don't yet know how that functions. We have not really delved into any specifics besides we won't be going to Williamstown and we will be making an Audible recording. That's as much as I know at this point. Other than that, I personally I'm doing well. I'm in my kitchen. I have people with me and 3 dogs to keep me company, and I am using this time to try to be still and sort of reset myself and think about what's happening and support the people who are going through challenges and look at my skill sets and see what I can improve. That's how I'm using my time.
Well, good. Well, speaking of skill sets, you started playing piano very early in life. What did it mean to you to know you had this gift at such a young age?
Well, I mean, music was just something I was really drawn to when I asked for piano for Christmas when I was 3. And my family thought that I meant a toy piano because of course that makes sense, but I actually meant a real piano, a big piano. And so once we sorted that out, they were like, yeah, that's not happening. So, but I grew up in church and I played other people's pianos and the church pianos. And then when I was 7, I got a piano of our own. And then I started playing restaurants when I was 10. So I definitely had like a real sort of attraction to the piano early on. And it was a language that just made sense to me. Mm-hmm. It was a language that I kind of spoke relatively quickly.
You mentioned 10. You were 10 years old when you started playing professionally.
Years old, and I, define professionally. Yes, they paid me.
Did you sit on a phone book? How did that work?
No, I was a real. I sat on the piano bench. It was a little dicey reaching the pedals, but I did it. Yeah, I was. I mean, I would go around and talk to the people. It was dinner music, so I would go around and talk to the customers and ask for their favorite songs, and then put them into medleys because so I wanted everyone to enjoy my music. I was a very bizarre 10-year-old.
So that's incredible. So afterwards, you went to Furman College, right? Can you tell us about the Pauper Players?
I can.
Okay.
I actually went to Conservatory High School first.
Oh, in North Carolina, right?
Yeah, and then I went to Furman University. And while I was there, so I went to Furman mostly because I wanted a liberal arts education. Mm-hmm. I had done Conservatory High School, which was amazing, but I started to be concerned that I was not going to be able to have like any kind of coherent conversations about anything except music. And I was just having these terrible visions of being in like a dinner party and them talking about a huge historical event and me sort of like looking blank and saying whole notes. So I just sort of moved to I was like, I'm going to get a more well-rounded education. So I decided to go to liberal arts school, and I was majoring in piano performance. I was spending my summers, I was in North Carolina. I was spending my summers at a dinner theater that is no longer in existence, but it was an amazing training ground. And it was called the Farmhouse Inn. And I spent 5 summers there. And I really fell in love with musical theater. I mostly actually fell in love with musical theater when I was 16, and I saw a production of the musical Baby. Mm. And I got very excited about telling stories with music in that way. And the collaborative nature of it, because I was really not one to love to sit in a piano like studio by myself for hours on end. So I liked the team sport aspect of theater. And so I was very interested in that. And so when I was in college, I got really interested in theater, and we didn't have musical theater at Furman. So my solution was I considered transferring, and then I was like, or I could just start my own program. So I started my own program, which was the Pauper Players, which was great because I got to learn, all kinds of jobs because I was the person creating it.
You had to do everything.
Oh yeah, I was the choreographer, I was the director, I was the music director, I was the producer, I was all the things.
Were you writing then too, or did you do already produced shows?
We did already produce shows. We did, and I got in a little bit of trouble with the department for pulling, because it's, they didn't really want the students to be doing musical theater. It wasn't really designed for that. And so I ended up it was simultaneous to taking some sociology classes that also changed my life radically, which I'm sure will come up. But I took a social problems class that really focused on the working poor and income inequality. And we took a poverty tour, and we spent 12 hours posing as a homeless person and sort of experiencing what that felt like. And so at the same time, I was taking this class that heavily influenced me. So I ended up making all of my musicals benefits for local charities, which made it sort of, you know, more attractive to certain people. It got the president of the university involved, and also like the faculty that were frustrated sort of stopped being as frustrated once I was doing it for charity.
Right. Well, many people probably know you as this amazing Broadway music director, but probably not as many people know about your incredible philanthropic life that you had. How did that get started? I mean, we're going to end up at A-Step, but can you talk us through, you know, your work with BCEFA for
sure.
Paul Newman, and then A-Step, or anything in between?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that, like, so the earliest incarnation was probably the Pauper Players and this class that I took in college, and turning everything into like we did the Fantastics, and we did it for Habitat for Humanity. So if you were in the cast, you built the house. That was kind of how it functioned. And then we took a collection, so it was a donate only ticket situation. But, you know, and then I did several others, like we did Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, we did Godspell, and we did those as like the Sunday morning service for the chapel for Parents Weekend, and used the money to go to local charities. So I was really into that. And then I started a little troupe called actually Artists Against Poverty, which is sort of like what I guess is the precursor to what became A-Step later. And we just toured around, and we basically were just for hire, for free hire, I guess, for any kind of charitable event where they needed entertainment. And then I moved to New York, and very early on got involved with Broadway Cares, which was pretty life-changing. And it came about because once I moved, I thought, okay, I had no job, and I was sort of temping, and I thought I should do something like philanthropic while I'm waiting to figure out how this business works. And so I knew about Broadway Cares, and I showed up at the office and just said that I was happy to volunteer if anything came up. And then surprisingly, I met a music director named Jack Lee.
Oh, Jack, okay.
Yeah, Jack Lee. I ran into him at an event, and he offered, he asked me to come over and audition. He was doing Sweet Charity as a benefit for Broadway Cares.
Right. Side note to everyone listening, Jack Lee was the original conductor of Sweet Charity on Broadway back in the 60s.
Yes, he was. And so I ended up coming to his apartment, auditioning for him. I had just moved to the city. I think I'd been in the city like maybe a couple weeks. So this was a very strange and fortuitous meeting. But I finished auditioning, and he said, I think you should do this big concert for Broadway Cares with me. You know, it's like not any money, but it's a really good experience. And I think Cy will really like you. And I was like, Cy, who's that? And he was like, Cy Coleman, the composer. And I'm like, aha, okay, cool. So I'm like slinking away, freaking out. But anyway, so yeah, so I did that, and we ended up doing 2 full weeks of pre-production because because Fosse, every time he set Sweet Charity, he would change it to the people that he had in the room. He would slightly alter the choreo, and so, or like make slight tweaks. And so every iteration between the original production and the different tours that had existed had slight variation. So they wanted 2 weeks to get in a room and sort of sort out what was going to happen and which version they were going with. And Gwen Verdon was alive, so she was there for those 2 weeks. So I sort of found myself in this room with Cy Coleman and Gwen Verdon, and they had 5 different people playing Charity, which were Gwen did a couple scenes, Donna McCackney, Bebe Neuwirth, Cheetah Rivera, and Debbie Allen. So yeah, I was like,
bad lineup.
Yeah, I was like, well, I guess I'm gonna go back to North Carolina now because I think I've done this huge experience, so that's it. I was like, here we go. But I got to know Cy, and we did end up hitting it off. He did become my mentor. And he introduced me to Paul Newman and the camps that Paul Newman created for children who have life-threatening illnesses. And that was a massive, massive influence for me, because meeting Paul Newman and getting to know Paul's altruistic nature was sort of, I mean, it was kind of before my career really had taken any steps forward. So it was like at a very specific moment of development, but it was really impactful to see someone who was so famous and so kind of full of wealth of, so, you know, monetarily and just wisdom, using everything he had to leverage it for people who needed it. And it was just incredibly beautiful. And he was so humble and loved to be in the sort of background. So I got to spend so much time with him, and it really changed my perception of like how music functions in the world and what we can actually be doing.
It's very true. You know, what he did for salad dressing is what we can all do with music, right?
Yeah.
I want to back up in a little bit, because so much of what you said was so great, and a lot of the questions that I get on the chat room and questions and answers are about, you know, how do I make it in the business? How do I get there? How do I get blah 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 blah? And I think what you're saying is a lot of creating your own opportunities and saying, you know, what you did with Pauper Players, you saw a hole and you filled it, and you didn't wait for someone to say, hey, why don't you do this? You know, you just did it. And same thing with New York, you know, that BCFA was something that they put all these shows together. They weren't hiring necessarily, you know, it wasn't a job and it wasn't money, but it was a way for you to do what you do in support of a larger goal. But then a side element of that is that you made these amazing professional connections. And I mean, we can't even count on both hands and both feet how many people have started their careers at BCFA. I mean, I remember Matt Sklar doing all of the orchestrations for everything, and he was, you know, just a kid, and now, you know, he's got 2 Broadway shows, and, you know, so many people hone their craft and participate in these events. And, you know, you were being involved with people who were just arriving from New York City, and then you're also involved with, you know, Donna McKechnie, right?
Right. It was a crazy experience. And I think, you know, the thing that was, that most sort of, I think, caught Cy Coleman's eye, which just thinking about that was my willingness to kind of do anything was because the Broadway Cares people loved me because I would show up early and stay late, because that was just what I understood the job to be, even though it wasn't really like a paid job. I was like, well, this is a job. And I would also be the one that was like, well, if you're moving tables, I'll help you move the table. And if you're setting up chairs, I'll help you set up chairs, because I'm in the room and you're doing it. And so, and it needs to happen.
Right.
It never occurred to me to think, well, that's not my department. And I think that actually was like strangely endearing, because I guess that was not the norm. And so, yeah, I've tried to keep that mentality.
Oh, and you have. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you get in trouble if you move set pieces anymore, union rules, but
yeah, right.
But that's great. So we touched on this, but I'd love for you to talk about A-Step, about what it is, first of all, because a lot of our audience doesn't know, and how it got started and where it is now.
Well, A-Step is a nonprofit organization that I started I guess officially in 2006, though it began in 2005, but we got our nonprofit status in 2006. And it's an acronym. It stands for Artists Striving to End Poverty. And it is an organization that is sort of built around the transformative abilities of the arts, to work with children using the arts as a way of teaching health education and life skills. And it began in earnest. You know, I had this sort of like altruistic background, I suppose, but I went to India and I spent 4 months volunteering in orphanages teaching English and music. And I came back with 2 very sort of like clear truths, I guess you would call them, for me, which were, the first one was that I was responsible for what I knew, and for what I had seen, and that because I had spent a lot of time in sort of like the the poorest of the world areas. And I felt like this was just not something that I was going to ever be able to forget. And that for me, the way that that was going to manifest was that it was going to sort of be a dividing day of sorts. Like there was like the time before I knew all these things and the time after I knew all these things. And so I sort of felt the huge sort of magnanimity of that when I came back and thought, okay, so what are you going to do? Like, what are you going to create or change about your life that is reflective of everything you just learned? So that was one big truth. And the second big truth was not to feel guilty for the massive abundance that I sort of had, because, you know, I came back and I was just sort of transfixed by like, oh, always running water, or like turning on light switches and being like, yes, consistent electricity, because those were just things that I did not have during my time in India. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to feel guilty for all of this, but I'm going to be very conscious of my good fortune, the privilege that I'm carrying, what I waste, and just be more mindful about it, as opposed to feeling guilty about it. Because I felt like guilt is such a challenging place to be. It's a place we go to very easily, but it immediately makes us want to tune out, because we then feel bad about ourselves, and then we don't want to look at what's happening. And so I felt like that guilt was actually creating blindness that I was not interested in. So those were the two mantras I came back with. And then it's sort of a long story, but I was going through a divorce and we had a house. And so like it was a whole big thing. And then I ended up taking, which you're not supposed to do, I ended up taking the money out of my house and starting the nonprofit. Don't do that. And then I just sort of was like, okay, I'm going to devote my life to this. And I was actually quite convinced that I was going to stop doing musical theater entirely. Like at the moment, a couple people went through this whole, like, I'm, you know, dramatically like, I'm quitting musical theater and I'm just going to be a humanitarian and that's all I'm going to do. And everyone was like, okay, sure. They were like, let's see what happens. But I was pretty dead set on it. So that was my big shift. And then actually John Doyle was the person who was the director that I did Sweeney and Company with. And he was the person who convinced me not to quit musical theater, which I can go back to. But A-Step sort of began in earnest then. And now our offices are in Times Square, and we've been around about 15 years, and we work in the New York City area quite extensively, and still in India and in South Africa. And we have a lot of volunteers. We run a lot of programs. And one of the former students that I met in India is actually, I've taken guardianship of, and she's in my house right now.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, she's back in the bedroom studying for college.
With the dogs.
With the dogs. Yeah, exactly.
So if we have many, college-aged people listening in the audience right now. So if one of them were to move to New York and say, oh, I would like to volunteer with A-Step, what would be the process to that, and what would they be doing?
So there's different levels of engagement as far as volunteerism goes. We've kind of created what I call A-Step on Stage, which is sort of our performance workshop oriented volunteerism, which is where you just basically commit to a day or 2 days, and you get some basic training, and then you come into, for example, we work in a homeless shelter in Queens, and you might come in and run programming with the kids that are living in the homeless shelter, as an example. So that's sort of like a very easy, less of an intense time commitment experience. Then we have much larger things we typically run a 6-week program with recently arrived refugee youth called Refugee Youth Summer Academy. That's in partnership with the International Rescue Committee, and we receive kids from all over the world that are being resettled in the New York City area, mostly not speaking English, and that's a quite extensive training process, and it's a 6-week program, and there are some small stipends available, but it's still a volunteer kind of position. And we run artistic classes helping teach English and we do a visual arts project called Footprints every year, where the kids get to process how they got to America, what that experience was like, and helping them understand how their culture relates to American culture. There's a lot of charades involved because we're still in the process of teaching English. But it's pretty amazing how art really does cross borders and languages, and has an incredible impact, and is so therapeutic for children who've been through massive amounts of trauma. So that's a much larger thing. And then there's international programs that you can apply for, like in India or in South Africa, which involve quite a bit more.
Right, of course.
Yeah. So it really runs the gamut.
It's really amazing, and it's something I really admire about you and everyone that works for you. Really, it's unbelievable. I could talk about ASTAB the whole time, but I'd like to steer the conversation a little bit back to your professional career. So your bio calls you a conductor, music director, orchestrator, composer, and arranger. I know what all those things are, but could you could you explain sort of the primer version of what the difference is between all of those roles?
Sure. So conductor, that's, I mean, pretty much the person who's conducting the orchestras. It can be from a piano or not from a piano. So from a piano or with a baton. And it can be a small band to a big orchestra. My conducting career has spanned a lot of different iterations, from small rhythm sections. Mean Girls, which I'm currently at, has 14 musicians. And then because I tour with Kristen Chenoweth, that's her music director, we often do like symphony concerts. I feel like, yeah, you and I've done symphony concerts. So sometimes big symphonies. And it's more, it's like being a performer or singing in a concert. It's that role. The music director role is a much larger and more encompassing role that involves a great deal of admin and strategy and planning and oversight and collaboration in creating. I mostly have focused on creating new works or doing sort of highly rethought revivals thus far. Who knows what will happen moving forward, but that's been my career so far, is like new stuff. Or reimagined things.
Right. And sometimes as music director, you are the conductor, right?
Quite often you can be both, yeah.
And sometimes the music director will pass off the conducting.
Absolutely. And say, I'm gonna pass this to you, and I'm gonna do the music director job without taking on the conducting responsibilities. Right. So, but yeah, so music director has a lot of things attached to it. And then orchestrator is a completely different job, where you are writing the parts that the musicians are going to play in collaboration with the composer, predominantly, and working with the rest of the music team. So deciding it's going to be strings here because it needs to have this kind of color to it, or it's going to be a woodwind solo because we want it to feel, it's going to be a clarinet because it's going to, have this kind of quality to it, or it's going to be big and brassy and lots of jazz hands here. So a lot of different colors that appear and that's really a lot like being a lighting designer or a set designer, in the sense that you are following direction from the creative team about what the mood is meant to be, and you're trying to match what everyone else is coming up with for each moment of the show. And then composers, when you're actually writing the music, and arrangers, when you're taking what the composer did and turning it into perhaps something slightly different, like stylistically, or expanding it with vocals. So you're morphing what the composer gave you.
Right. Have you ever done a project where you were all of those at once?
No, not as a composer as well. I mean, early readings of an off-Broadway, like of a show that I was working on for off-Broadway that never happened.
Right. We'll see.
Who knows?
And I wanted to just append arranger. There are arrangers, and then there are also vocal arrangers, in which you've used both of those.
Yes.
Can you explain the difference there?
Well, so song arrangement is if you're given like a melody and a chord structure, and you decide that you're going to turn it into a country song, or you're going to turn it into a bossa nova, or you're going to turn it into, something completely different than the composer originally intended, but the director wants to move into a specific arena, or it's a ballad, but he wants you to make it an up tempo, or he or she wants me to make it an up tempo. So things like that. So song arranging. And then vocal arranging is basically doing the same thing, but only with the vocal line, and creating an expansion of what the cast is saying through the different, like usually lots of ensemble, but it can be just, creating a solo into a duet or a trio.
Right. So I should say, just for the people out there, not all composers are arrangers.
Very true.
So when you get a song, Mary Mitchell, from a different composer, there's certain different amount of information that you get depending on the composer. Like I suspect someone like Andrew Lippa or Stephen Sondheim gives you a lot of information on the page. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then can you talk about some composers that may not give you a lot of information on the page and you have to do more arranging?
Absolutely. So yes, so Andrew Lippa, I would say, probably gives you the most information of any composer I've worked with.
And not to interrupt, but he's appearing here on the Studio Series in 2 weeks.
And he's amazing. You should definitely check him out. He's also just a brilliant human. But he can do every job. Like, he has the skill set to do all the jobs that you just listed. So he brings just an enormous wealth of information to the table, and he knows what he wants, and he's very clear about it. So that's super useful. So he does a lot, and he brings a lot to the table in that respect. And so when you get material from him, it's almost fully formed. I mean, I will say during the Addams Family, I ended up doing more only because we rewrote the show so significantly between the Out of Town in Chicago and the New York debut in Broadway. We had a lot of creative team shifts, and then we rewrote the show in like 2 weeks. So I ended up filling in and helping him sort of, finish sentences, if you will, sort of metaphorically, but he has very clear intent and he knows exactly what he wants. And then like Sondheim, when I did road show with him, that was a really exciting experience because he was faxing me like handwritten music, which I thought was really exciting and interesting. And he's also detail oriented. However, he tended to be mostly fixated on lyric and very fixated on his punctuation around lyric. So that was a really big thing with him. Was like, for example, when we did the company revival with Raul Esparza, he had us rehearse Getting Married Today, stopping at every punctuation mark. So our Amy had to sing like, "Pardon me, is everybody there? Because if everybody's there, I want to thank you all for coming to the wedding. I appreciate you going even more. I mean, you must," like, we had to stop it. And we had to rehearse it like that for a while before he would let us put it into the patter at tempo. He's very, very, very specific about everything. So that was exciting. And then, like, for example, working with Jeff Richman on Mean Girls, who's a completely different kind of composer, who's just a sort of genius at soundscape and character and understanding storytelling and comedy. I mean, he works with his wife Tina Fey, and the two of them together are truly hilarious because they are just always in a fast, witty banter. Makes you feel like you're in a sitcom. But they, he would do, his way of doing music was to send logic files of recordings. That was his that's the methodology he used for TV. So that was the methodology he used in transferring over to theater. And so that was very different. So there was a lot more, and he was much more about, here's the basic bones of what I'm looking for, fill it out how you want, let's talk about it. So it just depends.
Right. Well, I just want to take this on, just take it to sort of a different level in terms of, so the people in our audience watching are what they get, let's say if they get an audition for something or they're learning a song for class or anything like that, all they get is the sheet music and the lyrics, right? And what I tend to tell people is you have to know a composer's process to be able to interpret that. So someone like, and I'm paraphrasing here, you can join in and say I'm wrong or right, but someone like Andrew Lippa, who is very careful about notation and about what he wants, it's probably a better option to stick to what is printed there, the ink, as it were.
Yeah,
and then when you approach a piece of Sondheim's, that you can't do it without paying attention to the punctuation and the lyric. But someone else, like the composer of Mean Girls, maybe you would have a little more flexibility on the vocal line. You wouldn't have to maybe do it precisely as notated on the page. You know, I tend to think there's a big difference between someone like Bill Finn, for instance, who
absolutely
who doesn't notate
there.
Right, or Adam Gettle, who is quite precise about these things.
Absolutely.
So it's just giving advice for the people out there.
Definitely, I agree with all of that. Context being everything and process being everything. Yeah,
that's true. So arranging and orchestrating is different for lots of different people, but you've had the special, I'm not going to say challenge, just opportunity, let's say, to do a John Doyle production, right? So these are where actors are playing the instruments. So it just presents a different kind of opportunity. How is that different, and is the process different? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I would say everything about it is different.
I know.
You know. So yeah, Rob and I did one together. So yeah, it's pretty different. I mean, you know, it's a funny thing. Like, I think it's using a different part of your brain, I would say. It's the orchestration part of it, besides just giving, you know, colors to instruments and sort of trying to design something that makes sense from a dramaturgical, like matching up, like matching what the designers are doing. You're now, especially in a John Doyle production, the way he thinks about actor musicians and the way the musicians function. I'll just say for Company, for example, for that revival, it was a matrix to cast, because people would come in and they would just sort of bring everything that they could possibly play, and then just sort of talk about things that maybe they had played before or touched before. Like, I've touched the flute, you know, like, and so it was, and then we would just sort of make lists of all the things, because knowing that we were going to have to create a very versatile yet well instrument covered or group of people. So we needed several people who could play the piano, several people who could play the bass. We weren't sure about drums. We knew we wanted some strings. So we needed string players, but also, along with just sort of coverage in that respect, we were looking at the couples who were married. So like, we ended up with the couples who played piano and the couple who played strings and the couple who, like, so there was a matchy match aspect of it. There was one couple that we intentionally put on flute and trumpet because they argued so much. And there were, you know, like, and then we have the brass couple. So it was very specific in that respect. And then a lot of just deciding why each person would be playing when they were playing. Like, who were they in that moment of the song, and what were they representing, and did that have a dramaturgical resonance that was important. So it's like 3D chess in a certain way. There's just many levels and layers to the conversation.
I'm so curious about Sondheim's participation in this. I mean, he wasn't at rehearsal all the time, but surely he had the idea of how it sounded based on the original orchestrations, and this was clearly quite different and serving a much different purpose. Did he give you free rein to do what you needed to do? Was there any pushback? How did that work?
Well, I mean, the good news was I was pretty young when this happened. And I think that there's just an advantage to that because you sort of don't realize that what you're doing is so radical. And you're not as scared of like what the ramifications could be as I probably would be like now. Like if you asked me to do that assignment now, I would probably be way more terrified than I was then. And I was
Right.
terrified then, but I was like, it was a different kind of fear. I think then my fear was more just like, I hope I'm up to the task. And now my fear would be like, I hope he doesn't kill me. So like, we went, John Doyle and I talked about it, Steve, everybody calls him Steve. So like, that's the sort of bougie, like Sondheim Steve. But anyway, he ended up, he gave his approval to the concept that Doyle pitched him, and we sort of kept him out of it beyond that. I mean, I would say my mantra was basically forgiveness, not permission. And I sort of was like, I'm going to make bold choices and we're going to pray. And so, we kept him out of the rehearsal process. He flew, we actually debuted it at Cincinnati Playhouse in the Park. And so he flew to Cincinnati. He was supposed to come to a dress rehearsal, and there was like a problem with weather and he didn't make it. So his first experience of it was our first preview.
Wow.
And that was pretty terrifying. It's like, we just really had no idea like what he was going to say. And I had pretty radically shifted the tone of things per John's request,
Right.
into very specific places and taken the 70s out of the score and moved it into sort of like a kind of an amorphous time that had no real reference of decade. And had taken out some iconic things that Jonathan Tunick had created initially, which was relatively intense. And so John and I sort of stood in the back of the theater, pretty much holding our breath through the whole thing and sort of waiting to see what the response would be. And, luckily he really, I think it actually helped for him to witness it as a package, as a whole, to see how it all functioned together and understand sort of the point of view that we were coming from. He gave me like 4 specific things he wanted changed, but none of them were particularly crazy. And so we kind of kept working from there. So that was a huge relief when that was over, but it was a pretty terrifying ulcer producing experience prior.
I'm sure. We had Susan Schulman on Monday in the studio series here, and she talked about her revival of Sweeney Todd, and really how gracious Sondheim was, and not only gracious, but someone who actively gave the power to the director. And that's what she said she was so grateful for, that he said that, I will never contradict you in public. I will never give you a note in public. And this is your piece. If someone asks me if I like the drapes, he will say, I don't know, ask Susan, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most things, that's the thing that I most admire about him, is his ability to lean into being reinvented in a way that is not precious, that does not have any defensiveness about it, and is sort of like, yeah, if within reason. I mean, I think there are a couple of cases where he has like actually said, please don't do that. But most, I would say 95% of the time, he's like, give it a shot. I mean, this latest company that's about to open is radically reinvented also.
Yes. Yeah, it's pretty amazing, because it's one thing, what we know about Sondheim is how specific he is, right? And so it must be that more, I don't know, challenging for him to give up something that he's so specific about. So it's just another reason to admire Stephen Sondheim.
Yeah, there are many reasons to admire him. I mean, it's just, yeah, pretty fantastic, but also just really appreciates and loves artists and gives them space, which I think is so valuable.
Well, I had the opportunity to work with John Doyle as well on 10 Cents a Dance that we did together at Williamstown. Since he's so different as a director than pretty much every other musical theater director, can you just shine a little light on his process and what makes it so different?
Sure. So John Doyle, I would say there are many things about him that are incredibly specific to him. One of them is sort of the way he approaches the process, which is that he really comes in with a lot of fully formed ideas, that he has clearly spent a great deal of time sort of ruminating on, and he comes in with a very clear first draft, I guess, in his mind, that he sort of then brings you into and has you like respond to. With the cast, he sort of never talks above this level of volume. It's always a bit quiet, a bit somber, and the rehearsal room is a bit like a church service, and very sacred. He basically never raises his voice. And
I would just chime in here to say that the one note I got from John Doyle in the rehearsal process through 10 Cents to Dance was that I was typing too loudly on my computer when I was doing the music. So that's just supporting your idea that it's
supposed to be quiet. Yeah, everything is quiet. And if you, yeah, I got that note too. The typing too loud. Yeah, I mean, he wants everything to be pretty quiet and calm. And he runs, you sort of, I mean, there's something very magical about that, because you kind of enter his world. And when you enter his world, there is a stillness and you can see it in the work. You see it on stage. But what I do find fascinating about him is that before you get to that stillness in the product, there's this like flurry of a process where he will, first of all, he likes to rehearse from the beginning of the show every day for however much so he'll start at the beginning of the show and he'll go through a section, and then he'll go back to the beginning, and then he'll add on maybe the next 2 days, but then you go back to the beginning instead of it being in chunks. And then there's that terrible day that you try to put it all together. Like, he just always goes from the beginning to be, as you go. And I found that very interesting. One of my favorite moments that we had during company was the process of looking at, because that show is not linear, which is also a fascinating aspect to that show. But there's no linear plot, it's vignettes and things. But he had us track the entire show from the vantage point of different people. So like, for example, we did the entire show from start to stop, but only from the vantage point of Sarah. So it was like, we did only the things that Sarah was in. And so you just got a sense of like, this is as much as she knows as a character of this entire piece. Like, these are the things she's privy to, and these are the things that she knows. And it was fascinating to do that. He said he did that with Shakespeare, which I actually adopted quite a bit when I was teaching it in foreign countries, where we would track just one character and do the entire play just that character, and then do another character and do the entire play just that character, and start to see how they all line up to each other. So it was actually a really cool exercise. He also had a really fun exercise where he would, at the start of rehearsal, constantly put everybody in the middle of the room and say, okay, this, on a scale from 1 to 10, answer this question. If this is very much so and this is not at all, like, how trustworthy do you think your character is? And they would, like, and he would do it every, based on what you know today. And so it would continue to evolve. So there was a lot of aspects like that I found really fascinating, because there was definitely a sense of teamwork and collaboration and creativity, that people would really feel free to try things. And it would continue to morph as a group. It was very exciting, but it's incredibly specific to him.
Right. I'm glad you shared that. I think his process is really quite amazing. I want to switch a little bit to subject here and do a little more general. So as music director of a Broadway show, any Broadway show, actually discounting John Doyle because his casting is a little different. What is your role in casting? Like, what are you looking for in auditions? When do you join the casting process? And when you're behind the table, what are you looking for? And if I could just have you distinguish between, like, what are you looking for in an ensemble player? What are you looking for in sort of the lesser principal parts? And then, like, is it different for the principal characters? You know, that's obvious. Like casting Nathan Lane is different than casting the candelabra, right? So if you can
Sure.
distinguish about like what your part is and what you're looking for.
Yeah, well, I would say first of all, the music director is a key component to the audition process, along with the director and choreographer and casting director. I would say those are and the writers. So those are your like main team. Um, and depending on where you are in production, there's usually pre-screens that are being run by a casting director, casting office. So oftentimes, we will come in at the callback phase. So after they've already been through a pre-screen with casting. However, we do have open calls that we go to, and some of them are required by the unions. So that does happen. So the casting team will put together a set of auditions. You will come in, and typically you know what your assignment to cast is. So you're looking at how to fill all of those sort of vacancies within this company that you're going to create. And oftentimes there will be some people who have done readings or workshops, or if, you know, now we really do full casting processes for labs. I mean, it's a pretty extensive, because when you're casting that 5-week lab, you're casting what may be people that go the full gamut to a production. So it's a relatively intense casting process. And in that, you know, you've usually had readings. It could be a table reading. It could be a 29-hour reading that you did for 1 week of just trying out material. And so there are sometimes people who come into the process kind of having done the roles that are like most likely going to get them and the principals. Not always, and it can really vary. Sometimes there's scheduling conflicts, or sometimes the last iteration of the process sort of revealed why they aren't a good fit anymore, because now we're going to make this particular character a tap dancer. And we're like, you know, like, who knows? Anything can happen. But so those are all things that come into play. I would say there's so much to auditioning. I would say the biggest thing that we are looking for is for you to walk in, be authentically yourself, and demonstrate your skills and preparedness in that authentic way. So I find, for example, it gets complicated when people try to guess what it is we're looking for, because oftentimes they will, you know, try to be something they're not. And then it's like, oh, actually you would have been better off just being who you are, because it's not always as like preset as you might imagine it is. So that's one big thing, is just authenticity and showing up fully, and having done your homework, as far as like knowing your material that you have in your book. Having your book with you is a constant sort of thing, especially now that auditions have turned into a very tricky maze of material from the show that you're supposed to learn. Like, there's so much, you know, actors are giving these like massive packets of information of so many sides and so many songs, and you know, people are always like, do I really need to learn all of this? And it's sort of like, I would be familiar with all of it just in case. But if you want to, you know, if there's something that you feel really strongly about, and you feel comfortable being like, this is the one that I really worked on, could I do that one? Like, I mean, I'm never going to care. So I think there is a level of preparedness that's required, but also having your book with you and being ready to sort of show us 16 bars of your high range, or 16 bars of a different kind of style. Like if we would just want to hear you singing something that's legato, or, you know, and knowing what the styles are is a sort of, so that you can at least respond quickly. I always think I'm always sad when people don't have a table of contents because you get so nervous and then you're like, forget what's in your book because you kind of forgot your name because Tina Fey's there. And so you're just really excited that you love Tina Fey. And so then you're like, oh, I don't know. And you're like flipping through your book, we're like frantically trying to like call out names, but you can't think of the names because you don't have the title sheet of the song in there. And like, it's all those kinds of things that happen. And so the, again, preparedness as much as you can to calm nerves is helpful. And the one thing I would say, this is kind of like my personal thing. It's a bit of a like personal mission in life, I would say, when it comes to auditions, which is do not shy away from material that is known. It has become more and more common that young performers love to do obscure material. And I also love obscure material. However, if your book is entirely obscure material, it becomes problematic in the sense that sometimes Casey Nicolau just wants to hear a song he knows and hear you do it and not try to be figuring out what that song is and try to guess your skill level because they're also trying to understand how the song functions. So it's, it can have its pros and cons. Like, I would just say, don't be scared to bring your take on material that is known, because that is a common thing I see that I don't necessarily think serves people as well as they are thinking it will. A lot of times we're behind the table going, what is this song? Is the song good? Like, we don't know what's happening. As opposed to just being able to be like, oh, I see you. I see how tall you are. I see how you would fit into this world. I can hear your voice. I understand what your voice does. That kind of material. It's tricky.
Well, yeah. Can you expand on that just a little bit? What are like some of the good qualities of a good audition song for someone? And then what are like bad qualities that aside from obscurity?
Good qualities of an audition song, I think, are things that really fit you well, that you've worked out, that you know how to deal with a good or bad accompanist on, that you, we always know if it's not a good accompanist, we know, but like, we're all in it with you. But if you were able to navigate that, that's really important. And to sort of hold your composure. If you know what you're singing about and who you're singing to and what you want, if you've crafted something to just sort of give us some kind of dramatic context, it's really helpful. So I would say that's good. And where it gets complicated is that it doesn't need to be super long. Like, I think we always think it needs to be long, but actually brevity is your friend. I mean, because we know relatively quickly how you're going to fit into the matrix. And so then we are ready, and we're often running behind. So it can be detrimental if it's a really long, cut of a piece. Not heavily detrimental, but I just wouldn't necessarily encourage it. And then showing, breath control, range, all of your abilities, just basically showcasing what your abilities are. If you're a really great actor, choose things that have really great text. If you're a really great singer, please pick things that showcase your voice. And therefore, those kinds of aspects, I think. And then as far as detrimental, I would say things that are too long, things that are not necessarily, if you have obscure material, just if you have too much obscure material. It's great. I actually love a lot of the new writers, but if we ask for, hey, what else you got? Then give us something that people know as options, at least.
So that's great. It's fantastic information. So our audience contains many aspiring musical theater performers, but also many musical theater educators as well. So what do you see? I mean, you've been in the business
Wow.
a while, but there's been a proliferation of BFA musical theater programs in the last 20 years, right? And what do you see as the benefit of having more programs being dedicated to teaching musical theater? And a corollary to that is, like, what do you think is missing from their curriculum? Like, people who come to New York with newly minted BFAs, what do you think they're not getting? And maybe you wish that they had had?
I mean, I think the programs that are happening right now are like really fantastic,
Hmm.
actually. I feel like everything is really positive. It's very exciting to see people showing up in New York with the kinds of depth of skill set that I feel like these programs are providing as far as really covering um, acting, dancing, singing, and the combination. The only area that I've personally experienced that I think is really challenging and that I think is hard to train but needs more attention, most likely, is how to sing really well while dancing. Um,
Lauren, one of my students created, two of my students, sorry, Lauren and Richard, created a class that's expressly to learn how to sing and dance at the same time. But go on, I don't mean to interrupt.
no, I say bravo because, yeah, that's the one thing I would say. Because what ends up happening, and I'm unfortunately or fortunately one of those music directors who cares a lot about quality of long running performance. So I will, stand in the back of the theater and isolate you and listen to what you are doing while you are in the ensemble in a group number and dancing. And I will hear whether you are really able to sing or not. And it is a common issue that I have to call people into my office to have conversations about that reality, which is like, and unfortunately, because of the nature of the situation, people abandon the singing because they know that you can't tell if they're really from the audience, you can't tell if they're actually singing or if they're just mouthing it for a couple of bars because they're out of breath. But you can tell if you're not dancing. So, like, in that sort of terrible situation of like, well, I can't do both and I have to choose one, you're always going to go with choosing dancing, which is like, for me personally, completely understandable. Yet I will always be the one that's like, hey, but the job is both. So, like, I'm going to be here to tell you that this is the standard and this is Broadway. And unfortunately, you have to figure out how to do both. So, train by singing. I mean, I'm always like Beyonce sings on the treadmill, like, start singing on treadmill. Um, and the truth is, it's like really, really hard. It is really, really hard. There's just no way around it. And sort of, it's a challenging thing. And I kind of go, great. So this is challenging. I agree. Get to it, because this is the Olympics and this is what we strive for in the Olympics. If you're going to try and go for that, and it is high level. I mean, I will say Mean Girls is really tough in that regard, because the ensemble has just those dances are the choreography is so cardio centric, and then the vocals are also not easy, which is completely my fault. But and I have simplified. I will say, for the Mean Girls tour, I simplified stuff because I learned on Broadway that some of it was actually too hard. And I actually tried to get the Broadway company to let me change it for them, but then it became like a sense of like pride. They were like, no, we're gonna get it. So they didn't want me to change it. I was like, I'm totally willing to make this easier. And they were like, no, we want the hard version. So, which I admired. And so, but that's the thing that I find the most challenging in current iterations of shows, because I think it stems from, back in the day, you used to have a dancing ensemble and a singing ensemble, and they didn't have to cross over in the same ways. But the industry has changed, and as the industry has changed, the expectations of what you're being asked to do are harder and more extensive, and therefore, require more effort and specific targeting of training, I think.
Right, that's great. So before we move on to the Pivot questionnaire, which is one of my favorite parts of this, I'm going to ask you one more question, and it actually comes from our Q&A, which I think is a really good question to wrap up this part of it. We're going to get to the rest of the Q&A questions after the Pivot questionnaire. But this is from Sabrina. She says, what is something you wish you knew at the beginning of your career that you know now? Like, if you had to talk to 20-year-old Mary Mitchell, what would you say?
Ooh, Sabrina, there's so many things I wish I'd known then. So that the list is long. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I wished I'd known was that no one really knows what they're doing. We're all kind of faking it on some level. And seriously, and that it's okay to be in process. It's okay to own where you are in process. It's okay to say, I don't have that yet, but I am working my ass off to get there, and I'm gonna keep at it. That's probably the biggest thing that I would say I wish I'd known, was like, it's okay to not be completely ready, but to be really working hard.
I love that. I love that. All right, so the Pivot questionnaire are 10 questions that originally come from a French interview series called Bouillon de Culture, hosted by Bernard Pivot. But they're better known as the questions that James Lipton asks every guest at the end of his Inside the Actors Studio television show. And we're going to ask you these 10 questions here, Mary Mitchell. So the first one is, what is your favorite word?
My favorite word is empower.
Love that. What is your least favorite word?
Hubris.
The word and the meaning. I like it.
Yeah.
I like that. What turns you on, creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Authenticity and vulnerability.
Yeah. What turns you off?
I would say facade.
Fake. What is your favorite curse word?
Fuck.
I've heard it. Short and sweet. I like it.
Yeah.
What sound or noise do you love?
My favorite sound would probably be the sound of my dog nestling up to put her head in my lap.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Out of tune pianos.
So anything at Shetler.
Yeah, all the rehearsal rooms.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Diplomat. So, who knows?
Right. What profession would you not like to do?
Oh, this week, dog groomer. Because I'm trying to do that in quarantine and it's a disaster.
Yes, I think all of us share.
Oh my
all
gosh.
of us pet owners are sharing the same thing.
It's a nightmare. Anyway.
So the 10th question is, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You made a difference.
I love that. Mary Mitchell, you are the best. I'm going to go over to our question and answer question here. What was your favorite class in your undergraduate schooling? I mean, you talked a little bit about your sociology class, but was that your favorite class, or?
Was that my favorite class? I think so. Yeah, because it was the most radical class that I had. And the teacher that I had was always in trouble with the administration for being so radical and asking us to do such sort of off the wall things. And I think there was something about that I loved, because I sort of love rule breaking in a certain way. I love knowing the rules and breaking the rules. And I loved that this teacher was unabashed about that. But the other one I took was an English class that was around themes. Oh, hello, I have a dog. Themes around, I guess, LGBTQ themes in playwriting. And it was my first experience, because I grew up in a sort of sheltered environment in Eastern North Carolina. It was my first time coming in touch with Tony Kushner and Angels in America, and with Harvey Fierstein and Torch Song. And what was amazing about that was that class really radically shifted my life. And then years later, I was in New York, and Anne Hathaway decided to do an event at the Public Theater of cabaret, and Harvey was in it, and Tony Kushner came to it, and the three of us had dinner beforehand. And I was like, okay,
okay,
this is crazy.
That's great. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
wild.
So there's another question about your undergrad, about your piano performance. So Sam asks, how did your piano performance major prepare you for the skills that orchestrating, music directing, and conducting requires?
I mean, I think what was, technique is technique is technique is technique. It's everything. Technique is really helpful. And I think people, I'm of the worldview that like, you have to have technique. You oftentimes learn it and throw it away in a sort of way, but because learning classical technique for singing, for example, and then singing pop music are so different, but you still have to have technique. My view around that is that all the technique in the world doesn't matter if you have nothing important to say, which is a lot of like why I believe so heavily in the work that like A-Step does as developing artists, because you learn so much about yourself when you volunteer or travel, because you get thrown into environments where you're out of your comfort zone. And the truth of the matter is, like, we never really know what we're going to do in a situation until we're in it. We always love to be like the backseat driver and look at other people's lives and be like, I would never do that. But the truth of the matter is, until you're in it, you don't really know. And so the amazing thing about throwing yourself out of your comfort zone in those situations is being able to learn more about yourself and who you are and what you have to say. So those were the big aspects of like my two different worlds. But going back to piano performance, the best part about it was I had to take so many counterpoint classes and theory classes, and just the requirements that hit a performance degree are so much around skills that you end up needing if you're going to apply them in music later into arranging and orchestrating.
Yeah, it's true. I run up against this with my 12-year-old daughter, who is constantly telling me she doesn't need to learn algebra, because what is she going to use that for? But it really is, it's the technique, it's the process of learning something.
Right.
I mean, I had a pre-med degree, and
Right.
I use it every day, not for medicine, but because of the process, the ability to learn. So here's a fun question. This is from anonymous attendee. Hi, anonymous. They ask, how many instruments do you play?
Excellent question. I really play piano. I mostly play the organ, though some of that I learned in playing in churches, and some of it, I had one terrible summer where I was at a church, a Christian Science church, and I didn't know the material, and we had a very sensitive volume pedal. It was not my friend. So I would say that summer was super questionable about the organ, but I got much better at that. And then I played clarinet pretty extensively through high school and college. And then I was a voice major for a couple of things, programs. And so, yeah, those things. And then I sort of can fake around on a couple other things, but not to any real level.
Excellent. I think Lily says, what is your favorite instrument and why? Not amongst the ones you play, but just when you're orchestrating, like, do you have a favorite instrument?
I think my favorite instrument is oboe. It is so specific.
Yes,
like
it is.
It's there's no hiding with the oboe. And so when you use it, it's like a very strong statement.
It is very true. All right. Yeah. So you have any last bits of wisdom or encouragement? We have probably some people here are part of the class of 2020, graduating or virtually graduating this. So do you have any words of encouragement for them and about our future?
I mean, I think, we're obviously at a very strange time in the world. So I think the thing to sort of know is that the arts will always be important and survive, and especially in times of challenge and conflict like we are in as a globe at the moment. I'm excited to see what new art forms are created during this quarantine time, and what ways we learn to tell stories that are perhaps new innovation. But I do think, you know, sticking to the sort of core of why you believe in the power of arts is really important when the world is swirling around you and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of ground beneath you. And beyond that, I would say never, you know, I'm very much about growth mindset. Like, I just think every project I look at is free grad school if I'm involved in it. I mean, still to this day, I'm like, what am I learning? Who am I learning from? What do I have to learn from this group of people? And I think it's about, a lot of it is about mindset. You know, to me, it's the difference between like, I'm stuck at home and I'm safe at home. You know, there's a one word difference, but they're massively different in your perspective. I think those kinds of things serve you well as you're emerging into the workforce.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Virtual clapping for today's guest, Mary Mitchell Campbell. The SDSU Studio Series returns on Monday, April 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern with Broadway director and lyricist Richard Maltby Jr. Rounding out the week will be music director Jeffrey Saver, and then Friday will be composer and music director Georgia Stitt. The series continues on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at the same time until May 6th. See our website for details, sdsustudioseries.wordpress.com. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Mary Mitchell.
Thanks.